Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. Today we're visiting with John Guandolo, author of Raising a Jihadi Generation, Understanding the Muslim Brotherhood Movement in America, and founder of Understanding the Threat at understandingthethreat.com. John Guandolo, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. John is the founder of UnderstandingTheThreat.com, an organization dedicated to providing strategic and operational threat-focused consultation, education, and training for federal, state, and local leadership and agencies. He's a 1989 graduate of the United States Naval Academy and took a commission as an officer in the United States Marine Corps, having deployed in Bosnia, served for 1 year in extremist force, directly reporting to a combatant commander in a classified mission profile. In 1996, he resigned his commission in the Marine Corps, joined the FBI, serving at the Washington, D.C. field office from 1996 to 2000. 2001, he served for 1 year as the FBI liaison to the U.S. Capitol Police, investigating threats on the President, Vice President, members of Congress, and other high-level government officials. Shortly after 9/11, he began an assignment in the Counterterrorism Division of the FBI Washington field office, developing an expertise in the Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic doctrine, the global Islamic movement, and a myriad of terrorist organizations, including Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and everything except for Al-Jolson. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the time.
John, as we look at your background, you are trained, educated, aware, conversant, studied, and in advisory capacity to many who are lulled into this false sense of security of this religion of peace. You and I both know that it is not in any way, shape, or form a religion of peace. It is the counterfeit to the scriptures. It's the counterfeit to everything that we read about in the fall of Satan onto this earth, and it is a huge deception being perpetrated upon the world in a plan to dominate the world under Sharia through the process of jihad, through immigration, migration, and espousing an ideology that will tickle the ear but destroy the land. How did you get this call to this counterterrorism and this ability to explain this threat in terms that the American public would actually understand?
Well, thank you for that question. I never shared that word with you, a calling, but I do feel it's a calling. I was honestly at the right place at the right time in the FBI. We had a series of investigations in a unit. After 9/11, the Washington field office where I was stationed created 2 new units to be criminal counterterrorism units. And the second one stood up. My supervisor actually was asked to lead it, and he asked me if I wanted to come along, and of course I said yes. And it was great work. And there were several cases that we worked that opened my eyes to this. And one in particular was the case of James Yee, who was a military army chaplain, Muslim chaplain, who was actually arrested because he was the leader of a group of both civilian contract and uniform military linguists and translators. And they were actually, it was an espionage case and a counterintelligence case regarding his activities at Guantanamo Bay. And it was not handled well by the Army, I'm sorry to say. But the point is, through it and investigating it, essentially in the FBI, there's such a thing as a major case. And so our case was Major Case 189, and it focused on this broader case. And so it was encompassed over 16 cases nationwide inside the FBI. And the reason I'm sharing all this with you is I just started asking basic investigative questions. Where did Chaplain Yee get certified to be a Muslim chaplain? How does the process work? Because prior to this, I didn't know. And what I saw were there were two places, both major Islamic organizations that certified Muslim chaplains. And the interesting thing that they both had in common were that they both are Muslim Brotherhood organizations. One in Herndon, Virginia, the GSIS, the Graduate School of Islamic Sciences, and the Islamic Society of North America, which the largest terrorism financing trial in American history, the Holy Land Foundation, adjudicated in Dallas, Texas in 2008, revealed ISNA is not only the largest Muslim Brotherhood entity in the United States and the nucleus for their movement, it directly funds the terrorist group Hamas. So when I started peeling those onions, without over detailing this answer, what I came to in a period of months was that all of the major Islamic organizations in the United States were tied to cases that we had in the FBI to Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and other designated terrorist groups. And I will say, much like when I share my information, excuse me, with people today and they have a hard time believing it, there was a period where I had to digest this, that all of these organizations were hostile. But as I unpacked it over time, as I came to look at what they were all saying was the reason for doing what they were doing, from 9/11 to the Cole bombings to the 98 embassy bombings, going backwards and then coming forward. The Fort Hood shooter, Little Rock, Arkansas, Seattle at the Jewish synagogue, the guy using a machete in the Columbus, Ohio restaurant, the guy hitting a police officer in New York with a hatchet while screaming Allahu Akbar, all the way up to the Boston Marathon bombing, San Bernardino, Orlando, Fort Lauderdale, all of these things, they all say, including all the guys we arrest overseas, the people we meet on the battlefields of Iraq, Afghanistan, and in other places that we're engaging them, they all say they're Muslims waging jihad in the cause of Allah in order to establish an Islamic State under Sharia. And when you actually look at Sharia, at the things that they all cite as references for why they do what you do, why they do what they do, you see that actually what they are speaking about and publishing is actually taught at the first grade level in Islamic schools. It's taught at the highest authorities in Islamic jurisprudence. So that's the reality of the situation we're in.
You know, John, I don't think people really appreciate what you've done and what you're doing. You've come under a tremendous amount of attack, both from former FBI agents that have served with you, former intelligence community officers which have worked with you, who have taken the party line to try to attack the messenger, when it's the message that they have allowed to permeate the shores of America, and they have drunk from this trough. We look at James Comey, we look at Robert Mueller, two directors of the FBI that have bought into this Islamic agenda, the influences, the peddling of influence, the peddling of money. I remember the picture of Dwight Eisenhower entertaining the Muslim Brotherhood in the White House as the first time that this enclave came from the Middle East, but he came to it as a general wanting to know who these sheikhs were and who we were getting in bed with from an oil perspective. And I believe that he might have been the first to really sound the alarm that this is not something that we want to be dependent upon. But because of oil interest, because of our failed efforts with the Shah of Iran, because of our failed efforts in the Middle East to establish parameters for this social justice, humanitarian treatment, this is the most inhumane group of people on the face of this earth. We would call them barbarians, thugs, murderers, torturers, belittlers of women, rapist of children, and yet we want to open up our borders to this influence in a country that Yes, we are an immigrant nation. My father and his family were immigrants to this nation, but we were fully vetted and committed ourselves to support the Constitution of the United States of America. And we would never claim that there is a law higher than the Constitution of the United States. God's law, yes, but God's law supports an alliance and obedience and allegiance to the ruling government authorities because they are God appointed according to Scripture. So I applaud you for almost having to be Teflon in not allowing this stuff to attack you, because they want to discredit you, because you've taken this bold stand. You founded this organization that truly is, I believe, the only organization of its kind that breaks down this threat into terms that the American population can understand, but they want to be lemmings and bury their heads in the sand to deny this because they either it is such a liberal influence that they don't want to believe. But this is the counterfeit. This is not the truth. This is anti-Jewish, anti-Jesus, anti-Christian, and pro-Sharia, to the point that we watch statistically 2%, 4%, 6%, 8%, ding, 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 ding. That is the tipping point. That is France. That is London. And it's coming to a city near you. And while they're at 2%, they are absolutely the sweetest, most wonderful people in the world because they're not organized and well-funded to be able to advance the cause of Sharia. But at 4%, they become organized and more vocal. At 6%, we begin to see terrorist activity. At 8%, we're now in the throes of Sharia and no-go zones. Why don't people get this, John?
Well, that's a huge question. Why don't people get it? Let me give you a few of my thoughts from my experience and my understanding of this. First of all, this is a war primarily of narratives. It's from a military perspective. It's an information a battle fought in the information battle space. So political warfare, influence operations, propaganda are the primary tools, not the kinetic violence. Is not the main way that they seek to overthrow the West. Richard Higgins, the gentleman who was fired by Herbert McMaster, the president's national security advisor, said 1 year ago in July 2016 on the national radio program that the Muslim Brotherhood controls the national security decision-making process inside the United States government as it relates to this war with Islam. You can call it what you want. That is something that understanding the threat concurs with, that assessment. We've publicly said that. This is a war of narratives. One narrative says Islam's a religion of peace. It has nothing to do with the events of 9/11. ISIS is not Islamic. What we see today, for instance, in Barcelona, where another van has plowed through people and killed people, and they're, of course, in a state of high alert. That has nothing to do with Islam. Well, that is nonsense, and it's not only not true, it can never be true. And so what I think one of the reasons that's an answer to your question is because many people have a personal experience with Muslims that they found to be pleasant, and when they hear me or others speaking truth about Islam, they say, well, that can't be true because my friend so-and-so isn't like that. And my answer is that your friend is irrelevant to this conversation. There is no question and no possibility of factually controverting these facts, that Islam states it is a complete way of life, social, cultural, military, political, and religious, all governed by Sharia, Islamic law, which comes from the Quran, which you have to understand abrogation, that what comes chronologically last controls legally, and the example of Prophet Muhammad, who tortured people, who approved of people being killed, who mocked him, who married a 6-year-old and consummated the relationship when she was 9. and waged war on the non-Muslim community. That's the, as the Quran says, an exalted standard of character for all Muslims to follow. So that's where Sharia comes from. All Sharia law mandates jihad until the entire world's under Islamic rule, and all Sharia only defines jihad as warfare against non-Muslims. So that's what Islam, the system, is. It's a totalitarian system governed by real law. So when people ask, John, why does what Islam's all about, the most widely used junior high school textbook in U.S. Islamic schools, say on page 2 that Islam is, this is a quote, Islam is not a religion, however, but a complete way of life. And why does it say that the duty of the Muslim citizen is to be loyal to the Islamic State? And why does it say that jihad is most often understood as physically confronting evil, as of course evil being defined by Sharia? And then it says that a martyr or shaheed is someone who dies in battle against the non-Muslim, and that guarantees you paradise. People ask me, why would they teach that to 7th graders? And my question is, why wouldn't they? That is what Islam is. And that's what you see in every Islamic school on the planet. And the challenge that we, as understanding the threat, lay out everywhere we go, and I'd offer it to those people watching this today, is if you can demonstrate that something that understanding the threat teaches about Sharia, about the Muslim Brotherhood, their network, their modus operandi, that's incorrect, we will stop teaching it, we will remove it from our presentations and off our website, and we will give the person that brings it to our attention $1,000 cash. Now, so far, we've been doing this for 3 years, and we haven't had to pay out yet, despite the fact that I have offered it publicly to Muslim Brotherhood organizations, imams, and leaders of international Muslim Brotherhood groups. The reality is, the answer to your question, why are people having a hard time? Because I think human beings, when they meet other human beings that appear to be genuine, and then you say the ideology that this person follows is evil, they marry what you're saying with the individual himself. So somebody may self-identify as a Muslim and not want to wage jihad, not believe in Sharia. And you could say, well, then they should leave Islam. And okay, that's easy to say, but when you're living in a community that threatens you with death, the individual has a lot of issues they got to deal with. However, Islam itself is a barbaric and destructive ideology and system. That is not a question. And if people have a question about that, then I would offer up this. Islamic law, Sharia, in the law of apostasy, makes it a capital crime for a Muslim to teach another Muslim something that's untrue about Islam. And Sharia obliges Muslims to lie to non-Muslims when the goal is obligatory. So if an individual who's non-Muslim is relying on a Muslim for their understanding of Islam, in this discussion, that is an unprofessional way to handle this topic. If you're in the national security realm and your responsibilities and your duties include dealing with this threat, which they do, and you don't know what you and I have just been talking about the last 10 minutes, you are unprofessional and you are incompetent at your job and you should be removed.
You know, I hear all this, and this was the description given for Syed Rizwan Farouk. He was a wonderful neighbor. He was a family man. He was just delightful. He came to the office parties with his wife, Tashfeen Malik, and they were just a lovely couple, and we had them to our house, and he used to bring us these baked goods because he was such a fine young man. And on the night of the shooting, the killing of 14 people in San Bernardino on December the 2nd, 2015, CARE paraded out his brother-in-law to say, I cannot even imagine that he would do such a thing. He was such a fine young man. This was a couple with a great future. This cannot be. Islam is a religion of peace. If you kill one innocent, you kill the world. This is out of the Talmud. This is not a original Muslim thought. This is a Talmudic teaching by the sage rabbis that existed thousands of years before Muhammad allegedly had this download from Gabriel. This was the description given. He was nice. And he was nice until he was not nice.
Right.
He was nice all the way up to the point that he walked in and murdered 14 innocent human beings and destroyed the lives of 14 families. Exponentially put a blot. This is one of the largest single attacks on humanity, paling Jeffrey Dahmer, son of Sam. This is 14 murdered at one time, a mass killing. And it's less than 2 years ago. And we still maintain that all Muslims are nice. They are nice until they are not. Until the influence of Sharia force them to comply. Will they forsake the Quran? John Guandolo. Will they reject when Sharia comes? Or will they become obedient to the teachings of Muhammad in the Quran and line up behind the ideology as they have done in Germany, as they've done in Belgium, as they've done in London, as they've done in Africa, Asia, and Europe, as they've done in Malaysia, in Indonesia, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, when they all have to line up under the Sharia, under the laws of Sharia. There are not protesters in Saudi Arabia. There are not protesters in Yemen. There are not protesters in Iran. There's just not. There's no one who rejects in these predominantly Muslim nations the Ayatollah, the Imam, or the teachings of the Quran.
Well, right, and you've just made some very good points here. One about the deception, which I'll talk about. But no, what we've seen since 9/11 and really before 9/11 is the Muslim population, especially now, is flocking to this movement. You want to know why ISIS recruitment's going through the roof? It's because they believe they're winning and they actually think they're going to win. And I see a lot of evidence that that's actually true, at least in the temporal world here. They certainly seem to be gaining a lot of ground because most of Europe and the Western world is surrendering. We're taking a knee. We're complying with all of their demands. And and when I say that, I'm talking about our leadership. Citizens, obviously, of some of these nations are not surrendering, but they're being forced to comply by their government. So that's the first part. And I think that's important to say, is that when Muslims are approached and have to choose between adhering to Sharia and being killed, most of them are adhering to Sharia. Now, we certainly had evidence in Central Africa where Muslims fought Muslims and Muslims died protecting the people in their tribes that were non-Muslims that they had lived with for generations. And that's a good example of that has nothing to do, that doesn't disprove what we're saying, it proves what we're saying.
Right.
That if a Muslim defends a non-Muslim against another Muslim, that's a capital crime. And so they deserve to be killed, and that's what's happening. On the deception side, they're nice until they're not nice. I call them hair trigger moderates, right? They're nice right up until that, half tick to the left, and then boom, they're killing people. And we hear it. We've heard it since before 9/11. Oh, he's so pleasant, he's so nice, he's so helpful, because that's what Islamic doctrine teaches. And that needs to be understood. But deception in Islam is a core component of their war fighting. Muhammad himself said war is deceit. And the kinetic war is the smaller part of the war. The bigger part is all the other stuff that you mentioned. The insinuation into the community, the dawah, calling people to Islam, first asking for your request and then demanding your request when your numbers get big enough and you can be loud enough, and then physically taking over an area by the Quranic understanding, the Islamic understanding of the 6 stages of Muhammad's, how he conquered, the 5th stage being migration, modeling after Muhammad's hijrah until the final stage, 6th stage, which is conquering the Dar al-Harb, the house of war, where Islam's not the law of the land and Sharia is not the law of the land. So all of this is per the doctrine. And we have said for a long time it's all about Sharia. But the deception has to be understood. At the local level, when the incident you described after San Bernardino and Hamas doing business as CARE is on TV with the relative, the brother-in-law there of the jihadi, lies. That's what he was doing. He was lying. And that's permissible lying under Sharia. Listen, let me give you one other very, very significant. They lie at a strategic level. At a strategic level. So, for instance, after 9/11, a man named Anjem Chowdhury from a group called Al Mujahirun said on TV in the UK that there's no support in Islam for driving planes into buildings like on 9/11. Well, then he gets caught in a meeting of just Muslims celebrating the Magnificent 19 and the attacks on 9/11 1 year after. Well, once he was outed, then we see his physical appearance change. His beard grew, he changed his clothes from Western attire to Sharia compliant garb because he was lying when he said his first statement. You had just a very short time ago after the London Bridge attack, you had hundreds of imams come out and say, this is so terrible, we're not going to say the funeral prayers over these Muslims who did these atrocities, right? Unfortunately, Sharia law forbids them to say the funeral prayers over martyrs. That was on the front page of the UK papers celebrating how all these imams refused to say funeral prayers when all you had to do is open up your daggone book of Islamic law and read it. But because we are relying on Muslims to tell us what Islam is, instead of doing the due diligence ourselves, you have citizens and leaders all across the Western world that have been rendered strategically incoherent on this topic.
Well, as you know, John, we've had Chris Galbutz on the program who infiltrated. We've had Nani Darwish out of Egypt who came. Her father, a general, was a shaheed. He was murdered. He didn't become a shaheed. He was murdered by Islam because he was moderate. She has done a number of exposés. Tassir Abu Saida, Hussein Mashni, the list goes on and on and on. Abi Audi, all these who came out of Islam who are now doing these incredible exposés from the inside out to expose this ideology. It is not a faith-based system. It is not anything more than a complete, it's contra-Christian, it's contra-Jewish. The very statement of Allahu Akbar is Allah is greater is a relative comparison to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And every aspect of Islam is a relative comparison that Muhammad is the only prophet of God, that God begets not. He has no sons. This is a direct shot against Jesus, the only, for God so loved the world, he sent his only begotten Son. Everything is an attack within the very context that one out of every 55 verses of the Quran is an instruction of violence. And you look at the Mecca writings and the Medina writings and you see that this is a migration, and yet they refer you to this peaceful writing of Muhammad until he had his true nature was revealed. And this man who was a child molester, who advocates what is now the framework for Scandinavia being overrun with Islamic rape of blonde-haired, blue-eyed women for the sole purpose of thwarting racial profiling. of introducing into the economy a generation of fairer-skinned, lighter-eyed individuals to carry on the message of Sharia that will not be rejected because of outward appearance, but can assimilate into society and infiltrate into society and marry your daughters and the daughters of others who say, yes, I was raised that way, but I don't believe that, who have now permeated and penetrated American corporations, the insurance industry, the banking industry, Washington, D.C. It is so prevalent, and we've watched it from 1928 to present day, of this infiltration, and you hear the words, you hear the intonation from a Robert Mueller, from a Hillary Clinton, from an appointee perspective as we look at the circuit courts and their rulings, and you hear this underlying theme of sympathetic to the plight of the misunderstood Muslim. We are so underdog causally focused in America of minority rights that we have lost our ever-loving minds when it comes to this. And I am a member of the tribe of 14 million Jewish people that know what it's like to be persecuted because of our bloodline and who we are and rejected in every society in the world for 5,000 years. And yet I stand firm on this, that this is an ideology, our ideology of the Torah, our ideology of the Jewish Jesus, our ideology of the reconciliation of the earth to God is not done by force.
Right.
We are a defensive people. It is the Israel defensive forces, the IDF. It is not the aggressive forces. We don't insinuate ourselves in other people's war. We protect our borders. We do exactly what the Constitution of the United States says that America is supposed to do. Provide for the common defense and ensure the domestic tranquility. And they do it to the exception, to the extraordinary tight rein that says we are not an advancing party. We will retaliate. Our acts of aggression will only be for somebody who's installing a battery of munitions on our border. We will take them out because they are a plausible threat to our country. But we don't go into Afghanistan. We don't go into countries that are not a viable threat. And you can hold us back from bombing Iran, but the minute we have confirmation that they have a nuclear weapon aimed at Israel, we are going to respond. And we're telling the world we're going to respond. We don't care if you have our back. We got our own back. We have God plus us make a majority. And so we're seeing this people lulled into this false sense of security where they actually are drinking the Kool-Aid. It is nothing but a Jim Jones mentality. And they reject information. They reject education. They reject fact. And it becomes this emotional, soulish response to, even for the body of Christianity, to take up and bring imams into their churches to read from the Quran to prove that this tolerance, John, I just don't understand. Maybe I'm not smart enough. Maybe I'm half a bubble short, one sandwich short of a picnic. I just do not get it as to how we can't call lawlessness, murder, terrorism, and look at the terrorist acts of Christianity around the world. Look at the terrorist acts of Judaism around the world. We're not the propagators of terror.
That's right.
How did we get to this point?
Well, I think the answer to that, from my perspective, is I would start by saying I believe that the problem is not Islam, the problem is not Iran or North Korea, the problem is not the hard left Marxist movement. The problem is not Russia or China. I think the problem is us.
Yes.
The problem is the United States of America, over a period of 60 years. You can go back farther, but certainly over the last 60 years has surrendered its founding principles, first by pushing God out of the schools, by agreeing to push math and science and English out of the schools, essentially, and allowing a lot of garbage, a lot of social teachings that are inconsistent with liberty, that are inconsistent with the free market system, that are inconsistent with a nation whose law and government were founded upon the principles that the law of nature and nature's God, which is legally defined in the Blackstone's Commentaries, which was the book used for law in the United States and teaching law in our primary law schools for the first 150 years of the Republic, the law of nature's God, legally defined as Holy Scripture. And understanding that we are not meant to be a theocracy, but the moral bedrock and underpinnings of the Republic are meant to be the moral underpinnings as taught by Jesus and by the Bible. And that's a matter of historical fact. What I find in the work that Understanding the Threat does is, for instance, in our 3-day law enforcement program, the first hour and 15 minutes or so on day 3, we do a session on the founding principles as it relates to law and government. And when we unpack that and we're able to quote official government documents referencing the Gospels of Jesus Christ as the framework for understanding how the founders viewed what underpins the government and how the government functions, and because these are law enforcement officers whose duty is to enforce the laws of their municipality, their state, and the United States, and what does that actually mean as we unpack that, you should see the response to that. That, as much as anything else in the 3 days, blows their mind. And what they realize is much of what we share with them they did not know, but they realize it's the truth because of the way we present it. And I would just say, in answer to your question, there has been really since the 30s, but certainly in earnest since the 1940s, and you could go back to post-Civil War, looking at the progressive movement, but really in earnest in the United States when the first time U.S. school textbooks were changed in the 1930s. And we see that change incrementally until the 1950s and 60s when God is literally, they begin to remove God out of our school systems. The reason Thomas Jefferson said that nowhere else will you find the moral teachings better from Jesus than in his writings, the Gospels, that's the way the founders understood it. And I want to go one step further so your listeners and your viewers understand. The first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, John Jay, one of the 3 writers of the Federalist Papers, and one of the men that, really the guy that George Washington said was the most important of the founding fathers, he said that Christians should be in positions of authority. And the reason the founders believe that is, how can you be a judge who rules on the law? How can you be a senator or congressman who legislates the law? How can you be a president at the executive who enforces the law if you don't believe in the very underpinnings of the law? Now, he's not the only one that said it. Joseph Story, who's been called the father of the Constitution, judicially, of American jurisprudence, said the exact same thing. That the understanding is, and by the way, Congress issued a resolution saying the exact same thing. And they said, we're not saying that Judaism or Mohammedanism or infidelity should be an option. We're just saying that Christianity of any sect, we're just saying you can't choose a sect, but it has to be Christianity. That's the way the founders viewed it because of the underpinning. So what did the communist movement do? What is the Islamic movement doing? That's the pillar that they're attacking. They attack the family unit. They attack the underpinning of Scripture and the law of nature, which answers most of the questions as it is. They attack that as the founding bedrock of the nation, and therefore, since out of that comes our consent to create a civil government, a federal government, whose primary duty is to bear the sword and defend the inalienable rights that God gave us and no man or government can take from us. And out of that, you get liberty. And in a society like that, you then get prosperity and peace, which is why, for the first time in history, America's created using a system that was never used anywhere else on the planet, and it's been the most prosperous, freedom-producing community and government in the history of the world.
John, the media has rejected offhand, the mainstream media has rejected offhand your training, your teachings, your message. It has failed to endorse some tremendously articulate, factual, Taseer Abu Saida, work for Yasser Arafat. It's well documented in the Middle East who Taseer Abu Saida was, and now he's become a believer in the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. He came to faith in Kansas City, Missouri, turned his life completely around, and now he does once Arafat's man. He did a book called The Mind of Terror. And here's someone who was immersed, raised up, trained up, who ran away from home to join the PLO, to take up arms, to answer this call to become a shaheed, believing that this was the most noble thing that he could do in his life, was to die for the cause of Allah, only to find out that it was a false doctrine, that it was hate. It was not a God of love, it was a God of hate. It was a God who wanted to subject, complete subjugation of humanity, beginning with women, treating them as chattel, children to be toys for genital mutilation, for managing the population, for elevating the old world that a son is everything and a daughter is nothing. That this way to replenish the earth, to dominate the earth, was to have 4, 6, 8 children, to find out what the numbers on average of Christian families was, and to try to 3, 4 times that to be the model so that you could accelerate the growth worldwide as a percentage of the population. Statistical, informed, managed. This is managed from the highest levels through migration, immigration, population, advancement, and that no shore is protected from this. And we have now a president in office that understands this threat. His advisors understand this threat, but the American population will not support the protection. And when they become the victim, like the 14 in San Bernardino, and say, but he was so nice. Is it going to take that, John? We've forgotten 9/11. We've forgotten Fort Lauderdale. We've forgotten Orlando. We forgot the Boston Marathon. We forgot San Bernardino. We forgot those precious children in Oregon that were lined up. And the hero of Oregon was the second person to state that they were a Christian. This young girl who stood up, knowing that she had seen the first one who was a Christian was shot in the head. The next one who said, I'm not a Christian, was shot in the leg. Knowing that if she said she was a Christian, she was going to get shot in the head. And she said she was a Christian. And she took a bullet to the brain. And this was at the hands of a sympathizer. Someone who was, quote unquote, radicalized. Is not all of the Quran radical?
Well, there's a lot in what you just said there. I'd like to unpack some of it. No, the Quran is not radical from the perspective of how, within the realm of understanding Islam. When people say Al-Qaeda or ISIS are radical, maybe from a Western perspective it is. From the perspective of Islam, it's normal. It's the normative. Jihad is at the core of Islam. The as you know, Islam breaks the world into two parts, the Dar al-Islam and the Dar al-Harb, the house of Islam,
yes,
where Sharia is the law of the land, and the whole rest of the world, which is the house of war. The stated purpose of Islam is to eliminate the Dar al-Harb until the entire world is the Dar al-Islam under Sharia, and then you have peace. And the vehicle to do that is called jihad. It's that simple. There's no other version of Islam. There are not 1,000 interpretations of Sharia. That's a lie. It's a lie coming out of the mouth of every Muslim that says it. So that's the first part. So fight and slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. 9-5. There's nothing radical about that.
Right. Muhammad
authorizing and commanding the killing of Jews in order for Muslims to go to paradise, that's normative. That's why they teach it. It's in first grade textbooks. And it's in the Hamas covenant for that very reason. That the rocks and trees will cry out, "Oh Muslim, there's a Jew behind me, come kill him." That is core authoritative Bukhari. That is the most authoritative hadith in Islam. So what do we do with that is the question. So Islam is what Islam is. We need to understand it, but we also need to understand that there are human beings that are in this system. And I would ask this question of all the pastors and rabbis, and especially the large percentage of Jewish rabbis and Jewish groups that support the Islamic movement, that defend Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, and jihadi suit-wearing jihadis, if you will. And my question is this: number one, where's the other version of Islam being taught? The pink unicorn, cotton candy, lovey-dovey, love your neighbor version of Islam. Where is that taught? Here's my question: provide me or somebody with one authoritative book of Islamic law or one Islamic school where that is taught. Just name anyone on the planet. I've been on radio shows with imams and Islamic scholars and asked that question, and it's followed by a good 5 or 6 seconds of silence because they know there is no such thing on the planet. So then I have to ask, what in the world are you talking about when you talk about, true Islam is peaceful and moderate? People that say that are completely misguided and unaware of the truth. So that's the beginning part, is you have to ask that question: where is that peaceful version? The next thing, if you live in reality, is you ask yourself about history. And if you actually look at a factual understanding of history, you realize that Islam has always done what it's doing right now when it has the ability to do so. So back to a couple of the points that you've brought up. Number one, dealing with this. And number one, how do we speak truth into this? We are called, since you have brought this up and because it's the nature of your show, Jesus said, I didn't come to trash the law, I came to fulfill it, right? I didn't come to throw it out the window. I came to fulfill it, and it's fulfilled in the Sermon on the Mount when he lays it all out.
Yes.
That's what the Christian understanding, Christian doctrine has always understood, that it all boils down to love yourself, love your neighbor, and love your God. That's it. That's what all the commandments were meant for. They were meant to give us the framework to prepare us for that fulfillment of the law. So a lot of the old, the Levitical law, it doesn't apply. Whether you're talking about wearing tattoos or stuff, those don't apply. What does apply is love neighbor, love God. And what I can tell you from a personal experience is that Muslims, in the cases that I've seen, have not experienced true love. They have not experienced true love, number one. And so we can provide that to them. A God who's a father, a God who loves.
Yes.
However, in order to do that, I don't know, and maybe you can correct me, you're much wiser than I am in these things. If you can show me where Jesus said, go forth and be morons, then I'd like to see that. But I don't believe he ever said that. He said, be gentle as doves and be wise as serpents. And part of that wisdom, which only comes from the reverence for God, that wisdom we have to carry that wisdom of Islam, understand what they've been taught in order to navigate, right? So for different crowds, you give a different message. And that was the example that Paul gave. When he's with the Greeks, he didn't preach to them, he talked to them on their intellectual level. And when he was with somebody else, the Ephesians or whoever, then he talked to them about the pure doctrines, right?
That's right.
That's what we're called to do. So I want to boil down the question to this answer. I want to go back to the problem is us. There's a large percentage of Christians, in my opinion, after having done this for well over 10 years of traveling the country, I would argue really a good 12 years of doing this, traveling the country, meeting with many leaders at the federal, state, and local level, thousands and thousands of citizens, and just spoken in hundreds of churches and to many, many pastors and rabbis. And here's what my assessment is that Christianity, if you will, let me put it this way, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Savior, have been watered down to people who are too lazy or too undisciplined to follow what he told us to do, quite frankly. Now, I'm not, we're all human beings. We make mistakes, and we blow it from time to time.
Right.
He makes provisions for that in order to stay in communion with him. But that, my friend, I think what I see is the opportunity now is for all of us to simply speak truth and challenge each other within our faith, because we are called, according to Scripture and according to what Paul says, we are specifically called to judge ourselves within the church. We are actually not called to judge those outside the church. We are called to be kind and show them the love of God and the mercy and be a light into that darkness. But we are called to judge each other and hold each other accountable. I don't see it. And even within Christian circles, when you speak raw truth, when you challenge people, you're offending them, and that's not nice, and Jesus would have never done that. I have actually had senior people, both at different levels in the Christian church of a variety of denominations, when I'm speaking my message, they've said, well, you're offending people, and Jesus never offended anyone. He was loving and nice.
He offended the established way of thought and the following blindly of this teaching. Unfortunately,
they nailed him to a cross for it.
Right. Unfortunately, John, we've run out of time, but I want to encourage our audience to go to understandingthethreat.com. This is a tremendous resource, and the downloads are just extraordinary. The number of resources that are available to you to understand the charter of Sharia, the facts around this rising threat. You can sign up for their newsletter. It's understandingthethreat.com. You can get yourself a copy of Raising a Jihadi Generation, Understanding the Muslim Brotherhood Movement in America by John Guandolo. Visit the ignitinganation.com website. Go to ianbn.com, click on Books and Media, and get yourself a copy of this. You will understand in no pool, this is not a novel, this is fact. Presentation of fact to help you understand and navigate. There's a handbook for law enforcement, intelligence, military professionals, anybody who has an interest in knowing the truth about what's going on. And if you are in law enforcement and you want to book John Guandolo to come do a workshop with you and your law enforcement agency, you can book that and inquire about that right there on understandingthethreat.com. John Guandolo, thank you so much for being with us here on Revealing the Truth. We will see you again.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. God bless you.
Thank you, and you as well. And that brings to a conclusion our broadcast, our live broadcast day, but not our broadcast day, for we are broadcasting this program 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Continue to watch this episode all throughout the day, replayed every 4 hours until we're back here tomorrow morning in studio at 9 o'clock a.m. Central Time, when we'll bring you another lineup of great guests and prophetic teaching right here at 9 o'clock a.m. Central Time from our studios here in Birmingham, Alabama. Until we see you back here tomorrow, we bid you shalom.